The trial was set in Riverton, Kansas. Dylan Costa, 15 years old, had already been found guilty of the murder of his stepfather. However, for him, the courtroom was not a place of justice. It was a stage. His greasy, shoulder-length hair and smirking expressions during the victim's tearful testimony made it clear that Dylan saw the courtroom as nothing more than a performance. It was not supposed to go like this, Dylan thought. He assumed that the murder would be reduced to manslaughter, maybe second-degree murder. But no one knew about the smoking gun, the home security video that would break the case wide open. Dylan's narrative of a heated argument gone wrong would soon shatter as the truth surfaced. By the time the judge spoke his name one last time, the performance would be over. Dylan's life of arrogance and manipulation was about to meet its end. The arraignment had taken place 3 weeks earlier on a cold November morning. Dylan walked into the Riverton County Courthouse with his head held high, shoulders back, wearing a crisp, white button-down shirt his lawyer had purchased for him. His mother had begged him to show respect, to keep his head down, to appear remorseful. Instead, Dylan surveyed the courtroom like a celebrity arriving at a premiere. He made eye contact with reporters in the gallery. He turned to look at his stepfather's widow, Margaret Costa, and her family seated in the front row. A slight smirk crossed his face. Margaret broke down sobbing. Her sister wrapped an arm around her shoulders and glared at Dylan with pure hatred. Dylan simply turned away, unbothered. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Harold Brennan entered from his chambers, a man in his early 60s with salt and pepper hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He had presided over the Riverton County Court for 23 years and had seen every kind of defendant imaginable. But something about Dylan Costa unsettled him immediately. There was no fear in the boy's eyes, no remorse, just cold calculation. The charges were read aloud by the prosecutor, District Attorney Linda Vasquez, a woman known throughout Kansas for her relentless pursuit of justice. She stood at her table, shoulders squared, voice clear and steady. Second-degree murder. The unlawful killing of Robert Costa on the evening of September 14th. Dylan was accused of stabbing his stepfather multiple times during what his defense attorney claimed was a heated argument that spiraled out of control. Dylan's defense attorney, Marcus Webb, was a public defender who had been practicing law for 12 years. He had handled dozens of homicide cases, but never one quite like this. From the moment he met Dylan, Marcus knew this case would be different. The kid showed no emotion, no grief, no fear, just an eerie confidence that everything would work out in his favor. When Judge Brennan asked Dylan how he pleaded, Marcus stood and placed a hand on his client's shoulder, a gesture meant to appear supportive, but really intended to keep Dylan seated and quiet. Dylan, however, stood on his own, smoothing down his shirt with theatrical precision. He looked directly at the judge, meeting his gaze without flinching. "Not guilty, Your Honor?" Dylan said, his voice steady and clear. Too steady for a 15-year-old boy accused of killing his stepfather. Judge Brennan studied him for a long moment before nodding. "The defendant will remain in juvenile detention until trial. Bail is denied due to the severity of the charges and flight risk assessment." Dylan's mother, Patricia, let out a choked sob from the gallery. Dylan did not look at her. He kept his eyes forward, maintaining his composure as the bailiffs approached to escort him out. As he was led away, he glanced back at the courtroom one more time, his eyes sweeping over the faces watching him. He caught the eye of a television camera operator in the back and adjusted his posture slightly, straightening his spine. Even in handcuffs, he wanted to look his best. Marcus Webb remained at the defense table, rubbing his temples as the courtroom began to empty. District Attorney Vasquez approached him, her heels clicking on the polished floor. "Your client is quite the performer," she said quietly. Marcus looked up at her, exhaustion already showing in his eyes. "He's 15, Linda. He's scared." Linda shook her head slowly. "No, Marcus. He's not. And that's what should terrify you." She walked away, leaving Marcus alone with his growing doubts about the case he had just agreed to defend. Over the following weeks, as both sides prepared for trial, the investigation into Robert Costa's death intensified. Detective Sarah Jensen had been assigned to the case from the beginning, arriving at the Costa home on that terrible September night to find Robert lying in a pool of blood in the kitchen. 17 stab wounds, defensive wounds on his hands and arms, blood spatter patterns suggesting a violent, sustained attack. Dylan had called 911 himself, claiming he had come home to find his stepfather dead. His voice on the recording was calm, almost detached. The operator who took the call would later testify that she had never heard someone report a murder with such little emotion. When officers arrived, they found Dylan sitting on the front porch, his clothes covered in blood. He told them he had tried to help his stepfather, had tried to stop the bleeding, but it was too late. His story was consistent. Too consistent, Detective Jensen thought. Rehearsed. She began digging into Dylan's background, his relationship with Robert, his life before the murder. What she found painted a disturbing picture. Dylan had moved in with his mother and stepfather 2 years earlier, after bouncing between foster homes and juvenile facilities. He had a history of behavioral problems, violent outbursts, and an inability to accept authority. Robert had tried to be a father figure to him, to set boundaries and expectations. Dylan resented him for it. Detective Jensen spent hours combing through Dylan's social media accounts, his text messages, his search history. She found posts where Dylan complained about Robert, calling him names, describing him as controlling and oppressive. She found text conversations with friends where Dylan fantasized about running away, about being free from parental oversight. And buried in his search history from 2 weeks before the murder, she found something chilling. Dylan had searched for information about knife wounds, about how long it takes someone to die from blood loss, about whether security cameras record continuously or only when activated. The forensic computer specialist, Mark Harrison, had extracted this data from Dylan's laptop and presented it to Detective Jensen in a thick binder filled with printouts and screenshots. They sat together in the Detective Bureau conference room, reviewing each piece of evidence. "This kid was planning something," Mark said, tapping one of the printouts. "Look at the progression. First, he's just venting about his stepfather. Normal teenage stuff, really. But then, about 3 weeks before the murder, the tone changes. He starts researching violence. He starts looking for ways to hurt someone without getting caught." Detective Jensen nodded, making notes. "What about his phone records?" "I've got those too." Mark pulled out another stack of papers. The night of the murder, Dylan's phone was off for exactly 43 minutes, from 7:55 until 8:38 in the evening. The murder occurred at 8:17, according to the security footage timestamp. He turned his phone off before the attack and turned it back on just before calling 911. "Premeditation," Detective Jensen said quietly. He knew what he was doing. "There's more," Mark continued. 2 days before the murder, Dylan sent a text to a friend saying, and I quote, that he wished Robert would just disappear. His friend responded asking if everything was okay at home, and Dylan wrote back saying that things would be better soon, that he had a plan to fix everything. Detective Jensen felt a chill run down her spine. The evidence was overwhelming. This was not a crime of passion or an accident. Dylan Costa had planned to kill his stepfather, and he had executed that plan with cold precision. Neighbors reported hearing arguments between Dylan and Robert in the weeks leading up to the murder. Loud shouting matches about Dylan's grades, his refusal to follow house rules, his disrespectful attitude. One neighbor, Mrs. Eleanor Pritchard, an elderly woman who lived next door, told Detective Jensen that she had heard Dylan scream at Robert just 3 days before the murder. "You're not my father," Dylan had shouted. "You can't tell me what to do. I wish you were dead." Mrs. Pritchard had been too afraid to report it at the time. Now, sitting in her living room with Detective Jensen, she wept as she recounted the conversation. Her hands shook as she held a cup of tea, and her voice trembled as she spoke. "I should have said something," she whispered. "Maybe I could have stopped it. I heard them arguing so many times." Robert always tried to keep his voice calm, tried to reason with Dylan. But Dylan, he would just scream and curse. Such terrible language. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, Detective, and I've never heard a child speak to a parent that way." Detective Jensen leaned forward, her notepad balanced on her knee. "Mrs. Pritchard, can you tell me more about the argument you heard 3 days before the murder? What exactly did you hear?" The elderly woman closed her eyes, remembering. "It was around dinner time. I was in my kitchen and my window was open because it was a warm evening. I heard shouting from their backyard. Robert was saying something about Dylan needing to take responsibility, about how he couldn't keep skipping school and failing his classes. Dylan just exploded. He said Robert had no right to control his life, that he hated him, that everything would be better if Robert was dead. Then I heard something crash, like glass breaking, and Robert raised his voice for the first time. He said Dylan needed to calm down or there would be consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Robert mentioned taking away Dylan's phone, restricting his internet access, maybe even looking into alternative schooling options. Dylan went silent for a moment, and then he said something that chilled me to my bone. He said, very quietly, very calmly, that Robert would regret trying to control him. That one day, Robert would wake up and realize he had made a big mistake. Mrs. Pritchard opened her eyes, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. "I should have called someone, Detective. The police, child services, anyone. But I thought it was just teenage rebellion, just empty threats. I never imagined he would actually do something." Detective Jensen reached out and gently touched the woman's hand. "Mrs. Pritchard, you couldn't have known. Teenagers say things they don't mean all the time. You had no way of knowing Dylan would act on his threats." But privately, Detective Jensen made a note of every word. The pattern was clear. Dylan had not just disliked his stepfather, he had hated him, and that hatred had festered and grown until it exploded into violence. "I should have said something," she whispered. "Maybe I could have stopped it." Detective Jensen assured her that she could not have known, but privately, she made a note of the statement. Premeditation. That was the word that kept echoing in her mind. This was not a crime of passion. This was planned. She returned to the crime scene multiple times, walking through the house, trying to piece together what had happened that night. The kitchen was where Robert had died, but blood evidence suggested the confrontation had started in the living room. Dylan had claimed he was not home when the murder occurred, but forensic analysis of his shoes found blood spatter consistent with being present during the attack. His story was falling apart. Detective Jensen also discovered something else during her investigation. Robert Costa had a life insurance policy worth $500,000. Dylan's mother, Patricia, was the primary beneficiary. But the policy also included provisions for Dylan's education and future care. If Robert died, Dylan stood to benefit significantly. Financial motive, added to the pattern of animosity and conflict, created a compelling picture of premeditated murder. But the most important piece of evidence came from an unexpected source. Robert Costa had installed a home security system 6 months before his death. He had been concerned about break-ins in the neighborhood and wanted to protect his family. The system included cameras at the front door, back door, and one in the hallway that provided a partial view into the kitchen. Robert had never told Dylan about the hallway camera. He had not wanted Dylan to feel surveilled in his own home. That camera had recorded everything. Detective Jensen discovered the security system while reviewing Robert's financial records. She noticed monthly payments to safeguard home security and immediately contacted the company. The footage was stored on a cloud server, accessible with a password. It took 2 days to obtain the warrant and access the account. But when Detective Jensen finally viewed the footage from September 14th, her hands trembled. The video showed Dylan deliberately luring Robert into the kitchen. It showed the confrontation escalating not because of Robert's actions, but because of Dylan's calculated provocations. It showed Dylan retrieving the knife from the drawer. It showed him attacking Robert with precision and intent. There was no self-defense, no accident, just cold-blooded, premeditated murder. Detective Jensen immediately contacted District Attorney Vasquez. They watched the video together in silence. The only sound in the room, the muffled audio from the recording. When it ended, Linda Vasquez sat back in her chair and exhaled slowly. "We need to upgrade the charges," she said quietly. "This is first-degree murder." Detective Jensen nodded. "I'll prepare the evidence report. We'll need to verify the authenticity of the footage, establish chain of custody, have the tech team confirm it hasn't been tampered with." "Do it," Linda said. "And Sarah, keep this quiet. I don't want the defense knowing about this until we're ready to use it in court. This is our smoking gun." The trial began on a gray Monday morning in early January. The courthouse was packed with reporters, curious citizens, and victim advocates. Margaret Costa sat in the front row with her family, dressed in black, her eyes red from weeks of crying. She clutched a photograph of Robert, taken on their wedding day 5 years earlier. He had been smiling, full of hope for their future together. Now he was gone, killed by the troubled teenager he had tried so hard to help. Dylan entered the courtroom with the same arrogant swagger he had displayed at the arraignment. His hair was pulled back into a ponytail, and he wore a navy blue suit that Marcus Webb had provided. But even the formal attire could not mask Dylan's contempt for the proceedings. He glanced around the courtroom, noting the cameras positioned in the back, the reporters scribbling in their notebooks, the jury box filled with 12 citizens who would decide his fate. The jury had been selected over the previous week. 8 women, 4 men, ranging in age from 25 to 67. A mix of occupations, backgrounds, and life experiences. Marcus had done his best to select jurors who might be sympathetic to a troubled teenager, who might see Dylan as a victim of a broken system rather than a cold-blooded killer. Linda Vasquez had focused on selecting jurors who valued accountability and justice, who would not be swayed by age or manufactured sympathy. Judge Brennan called the court to order and gave preliminary instructions to the jury. He explained the charges, the burden of proof, the presumption of innocence. Dylan listened with a bored expression, occasionally glancing at his fingernails or adjusting his tie. Marcus elbowed him gently, whispering for him to pay attention to look engaged. Dylan ignored him. Linda Vasquez rose to deliver her opening statement. She approached the jury box slowly, making eye contact with each juror before she began to speak. Her voice was calm but firm, her words carefully chosen. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is about a young man who made a choice. Not a mistake, not an accident. A choice. On September 14th of last year, the defendant, Dylan Costa, made the conscious decision to end the life of his stepfather, Robert Costa. He did not act in self-defense. He did not lash out in a moment of uncontrollable rage. He planned it, he executed it, and then he lied about it. She paused, letting her words sink in. Dylan stared at her with a slight smirk, as if amused by her performance. Over the course of this trial, you will hear testimony from witnesses who saw the relationship between Dylan and Robert deteriorate in the weeks leading up to the murder. You will hear from forensic experts who will explain the nature of Robert's injuries and what they tell us about how he died. You will hear from investigators who uncovered evidence that directly contradicts Dylan's claim of innocence. And you will see evidence, undeniable evidence, that proves beyond any reasonable doubt that Dylan Costa committed first-degree murder. She walked back to her table, but before sitting down, she turned to face the jury one more time. Robert Costa was a good man. He worked hard to provide for his family. He opened his home to a troubled teenager, hoping to give him stability and guidance. And for that kindness, for that compassion, he was brutally murdered in his own kitchen. We owe it to Robert, to his widow Margaret, and to this community to hold Dylan Costa accountable for what he did. Thank you. Marcus Webb stood for the defense. He was a shorter man, stocky with thinning brown hair and glasses that constantly slid down his nose. He had a gentle demeanor, the kind of lawyer who relied on empathy and connection rather than aggression. As he approached the jury, he pushed his glasses up and offered them a small, sad smile. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to stand here and tell you that Robert Costa's death wasn't a tragedy. It was. A man lost his life, a wife lost her husband, and a community lost a good person. But what the prosecution is asking you to believe is that a 15-year-old boy, a child really, carefully planned and executed a murder with the cold calculation of a hardened criminal. That's simply not what happened. He gestured toward Dylan, who sat at the defense table trying to look sympathetic, but mostly appearing indifferent. Dylan Costa has had a difficult life. He's been through the foster system, dealt with abandonment and instability, and struggled to find his place in the world. When he came to live with his mother and Robert, there were conflicts. Of course there were. Blending a family is hard, especially with a teenager who has been through trauma. But Dylan did not plan to kill Robert. What happened on September 14th was a tragic escalation of an argument, a moment where emotions spiraled out of control. Marcus paused, looking each juror in the eye. The prosecution will present their case, and they will try to paint Dylan as a monster. But I ask you to see him for what he really is. A troubled kid who made a terrible mistake, not a murderer. Thank you. Dylan watched Marcus return to his seat and barely suppressed an eye roll. Marcus had told him to look remorseful during the trial, to show emotion, to make the jury believe he was suffering. But Dylan could not be bothered with such theatrics. He knew what he was, and he knew he was smarter than everyone in this courtroom. The prosecution began calling witnesses. The first was Officer Michael Torres, one of the responding officers who had arrived at the Costa home that night. He testified about finding Robert's body, about Dylan's demeanor, about the blood evidence at the scene. Linda Vasquez walked him through his observations methodically, establishing the timeline and the initial evidence. Under cross-examination, Marcus tried to emphasize Dylan's youth and apparent shock. Officer Torres, when you arrived, did Dylan appear to be in distress? He appeared calm, sir. But isn't it possible that he was in shock? That he had just witnessed a horrific scene and his mind was protecting him from the trauma? Officer Torres hesitated. It's possible, but in my experience, most people who discover a body, especially a family member, show more emotion, crying, shaking, even anger. Dylan showed none of that. Marcus nodded slowly, trying to salvage the point. But you're not a psychologist, are you, officer? No, sir, I'm not. So you can't really say for certain what Dylan was feeling in that moment, can you? No, sir. It was a small victory, but Marcus would take what he could get. Dylan, however, seemed unimpressed, slouching in his chair and glancing at the clock on the wall. The next witness was the 911 operator, Rachel Martinez, who had taken Dylan's call that night. Linda played the audio recording for the jury, and the courtroom fell silent as they listened to Dylan's flat, emotionless voice reporting his stepfather's death. 911, what's your emergency? My stepfather is dead. Someone killed him. Okay, stay calm. Where are you located? 427 Maple Street. He's in the kitchen. There's blood everywhere. Are you in danger? Is the person who did this still there? No, I just got home. He's already dead. Okay, I'm sending officers to your location now. Can you tell me your name? Dylan Costa. Dylan, I need you to stay on the line with me. Are you injured? No, I'm fine. The recording continued for another 2 minutes, with Rachel trying to keep Dylan calm and gather information. But Dylan's tone never changed, never wavered. Even when Rachel asked if he was sure Robert was dead, if there was any chance he could still be alive, Dylan responded with cold certainty. He's dead. Trust me. When the recording ended, several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Rachel Martinez testified that in her 8 years as an operator, she had never taken a call quite like that one. Most people are panicked, hysterical, desperate for help, she explained. Dylan sounded like he was ordering a pizza. Marcus objected, arguing that the characterization was prejudicial, and Judge Brennan sustained the objection. But the damage was done. The jury had heard the recording. They had heard Dylan's voice, and they were disturbed by it. As the first day of trial drew to a close, Margaret Costa took the stand for victim impact testimony. She was a small woman, thin and fragile-looking, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a simple black dress and clutched a tissue in her trembling hands. Linda Vasquez approached her gently, giving her time to compose herself. Mrs. Costa, can you tell the jury about your husband, Robert? Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. He was the kindest man I ever knew. He worked as a contractor, building homes for families. He loved his work. He loved helping people. When I told him about Dylan, about Patricia's son and the struggles he'd been through, Robert didn't hesitate. He said we had to help, that we had to give Dylan a home and a chance at a better life. She paused, wiping her eyes. Robert tried so hard with Dylan. He set up rules, boundaries, tried to be a father figure. But Dylan, he wouldn't accept it. He was angry all the time, resentful. He told Robert he hated him. He said terrible things. Can you describe your relationship with Dylan before the murder? Margaret shook her head. There was no relationship. He barely spoke to me. When he did, it was to complain or demand something. He had no respect for our home, for our rules. But Robert never gave up on him. Even when I suggested maybe Dylan should go somewhere else, get professional help, Robert insisted we keep trying. Linda paused, letting the jury absorb Margaret's words. Mrs. Costa, can you tell the jury about the night Robert died? Margaret broke down completely, her shoulders shaking with sobs. Judge Brennan called for a brief recess to allow her to compose herself. During the break, Dylan sat at the defense table, completely unmoved by her testimony. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and yawned. Several jurors noticed. When court resumed, Margaret continued her testimony, describing how she had been at her sister's house that evening, how she received the call from police telling her to come home immediately, how she arrived to find her house surrounded by squad cars and yellow crime scene tape. She described seeing Robert's body being wheeled out on a gurney, covered with a white sheet stained with blood. She described collapsing on the front lawn, unable to breathe, unable to process what had happened. I keep thinking about the last thing I said to him that morning, Margaret whispered. I was rushing out the door for work and he was making breakfast. He called out that he loved me and I didn't say it back. I was in a hurry, distracted. I just waved and left. Those were the last words he ever said to me, and I didn't say them back. She looked directly at Dylan, her eyes filled with grief and rage. You took him from me. You took the love of my life. And for what? Because he asked you to clean your room? Because he expected you to go to school? You're a monster. Marcus objected, but Judge Brennan overruled him. Margaret had earned the right to speak her truth. As Margaret was helped down from the witness stand by her sister, Dylan met her gaze and smirked. It was a barely perceptible expression, a tiny upturn of his lips. But Margaret saw it. So did several jurors, and so did Judge Brennan, whose jaw tightened as he made a note on his legal pad. The trial continued over the following days, with a parade of witnesses testifying to Dylan's troubled behavior, his conflicts with Robert, and his suspicious actions before and after the murder. Dylan's school counselor, Mrs. Patricia Hammond, testified that Dylan had been failing most of his classes and had been suspended multiple times for fighting and disrespectful behavior toward teachers. Did Dylan ever speak about his home life? Linda asked. Yes, Mrs. Hammond replied. He told me several times that he hated his stepfather, that Robert was controlling and unfair. I tried to explain that parents set rules because they care, but Dylan wasn't interested in that perspective. He felt entitled to do whatever he wanted. Did he ever make threats? Mrs. Hammond hesitated, then nodded. In November, about a month before the murder, Dylan came to my office very agitated. He had just received his report card and knew Robert would be angry about his grades. He said, and I quote, that Robert needed to back off or there would be consequences. I asked what he meant by that, and he just glared at me and walked out. Marcus cross-examined Mrs. Hammond, trying to establish that Dylan was simply a frustrated teenager acting out, not a murderer in the making. But her testimony had been damning, and the jury's expressions showed they were growing increasingly convinced of Dylan's guilt. Detective Jensen took the stand next, and Linda Vasquez walked her through the investigation methodically. She described the crime scene, the evidence collected, the forensic analysis conducted. She explained how the blood spatter patterns indicated Robert had tried to defend himself, how the number and location of stab wounds suggested sustained, intentional violence. Detective Jensen, in your professional opinion, based on your years of experience investigating homicides, was this a crime of passion or a planned attack? Detective Jensen looked directly at the jury. In my 20 years as a homicide detective, I've seen both types of killings. Crimes of passion are chaotic, messy, often involving whatever weapon is nearby. The victim might have one or two fatal wounds, inflicted in a moment of rage. This was different. Robert Costa had 17 stab wounds, inflicted with a kitchen knife that had been removed from a drawer and used with precision. The attack was sustained over several minutes. That level of violence requires not just rage, but determination, intent. She continued, describing how the investigation had uncovered Dylan's financial motive, his history of conflict with Robert, and the inconsistencies in his initial statement to police. Dylan told us he came home and found Robert already dead. But forensic evidence, including blood spatter on his shoes and clothing, proved he was present during the attack. When we confronted him with this evidence, he changed his story. He then claimed it was self-defense, that Robert had attacked him first. But there was no evidence to support that claim. Robert's wounds were all offensive, not defensive. He was trying to protect himself from Dylan, not the other way around. Marcus cross-examined Detective Jensen aggressively, trying to poke holes in the investigation, suggesting evidence had been mishandled or misinterpreted. But Detective Jensen remained calm and professional, answering each question with confidence and precision. She had worked this case for months, and she knew every detail by heart. As the trial moved into its second week, the prosecution called expert witnesses to testify about the forensic evidence. Dr. Elizabeth Reeves, the medical examiner who had performed Robert's autopsy, took the stand and methodically described each wound, each injury, each piece of evidence that told the story of how Robert Costa had died. Dr. Reeves, can you describe the nature of the wounds on Mr. Costa's body? Mr. Costa sustained 17 stab wounds, primarily to his chest, abdomen, and upper arms. The wounds varied in depth, but several penetrated vital organs, including his heart and lungs. The cause of death was exsanguination, or blood loss, combined with cardiac injury. Did Mr. Costa have any defensive wounds? Yes. He had multiple lacerations on his hands and forearms, consistent with trying to grab or deflect a blade. These are classic defensive injuries seen in victims who are conscious and trying to protect themselves during an attack. In your expert opinion, how long would this attack have taken? Dr. Reeves paused, considering the question carefully. Based on the number and pattern of wounds, I estimate the attack lasted between 2 and 3 minutes. Long enough for the victim to realize what was happening and attempt to defend himself. Long enough for the perpetrator to have multiple opportunities to stop. And in those 2 to 3 minutes, would Mr. Costa have been able to cry out, to call for help? Initially, yes. But as his lungs filled with blood and he lost oxygen, his ability to vocalize would have diminished. The final moments would have been marked by gasping and gurgling sounds as he struggled to breathe. The courtroom fell silent. Several jurors looked ill. Margaret Costa left the courtroom, unable to hear the clinical description of her husband's final moments. Dylan, however, remained expressionless, as if the testimony had nothing to do with him. Marcus tried to undermine Dr. Reeves's testimony during cross-examination, suggesting alternative explanations for the wound patterns. But she remained firm in her conclusions. The evidence was clear. Robert Costa had been murdered in a prolonged, violent attack. The prosecution also called forensic specialists who testified about the blood evidence, the weapon used, and the lack of any indication that Dylan had acted in self-defense. Every piece of evidence pointed to premeditated murder, and Dylan's arrogance throughout the trial only reinforced the prosecution's narrative. But Dylan remained confident. he whispered to Marcus during breaks, joking about the witnesses, dismissing the evidence. He seemed to genuinely believe that his performance, his carefully constructed image of a misunderstood teenager, would be enough to create reasonable doubt. Marcus, meanwhile, was growing increasingly frustrated with his client. During a recess on the 8th day of trial, he pulled Dylan into a private conference room adjacent to the courtroom and confronted him. "You need to take this seriously," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Do you understand what's happening here? You're on trial for first-degree murder. If you're convicted, you're going to spend the rest of your life in prison. And right now, the jury hates you." Dylan leaned back in his chair, smirking. "They don't hate me. They don't know me." "That's exactly the problem," Marcus snapped. "You're not giving them anything. No emotion, no remorse, no humanity. You're sitting in that courtroom like you're watching a movie, not fighting for your life." "What do you want me to do?" Dylan asked, his tone mocking. "Cry on command? Pretend I'm sorry? That's not who I am." "Then maybe you should start pretending," Marcus said. "Because right now, you're making it very easy for that jury to see you as a killer." Dylan stood up, brushing past Marcus toward the door. "The jury is going to do whatever they're going to do. But I didn't plan to kill Robert. It just happened. And eventually, they'll see that." Marcus watched him leave. And for the first time since taking the case, he wondered if Dylan actually believed his own lies, or if he simply did not care about the truth. The trial moved into its 3rd week, and the prosecution began laying the groundwork for their smoking gun evidence. They called representatives from Safeguard Home Security to testify about the system Robert had installed, about how the cameras worked, about how footage was stored and accessed. They established that the system had been operational on September 14th, and that the footage had been preserved according to proper protocol. Dylan, for the first time, showed a flicker of concern. He leaned over to Marcus and whispered urgently, "What are they talking about? What footage?" Marcus looked at him, confused. "What do you mean? Didn't you know about the security cameras?" Dylan's face paled slightly. "Robert never told me about cameras inside the house." Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "Inside? Dylan, what exactly are they going to see on that footage?" But before Dylan could answer, Judge Brennan called the court back to order, and the moment passed. The prosecution then called their digital forensics expert, Dr. Michael Chen, who testified about the process of retrieving and authenticating the security footage. He explained how he had examined the video files for any signs of tampering or manipulation, how he had verified the timestamps and metadata, how he had ensured the integrity of the evidence. "Dr. Chen, in your expert opinion, is the footage authentic?" "Yes. I found no evidence of editing, manipulation, or alteration. The footage is a genuine recording from the date and time in question." Linda Vasquez nodded. "Your Honor, the state would like to request permission to present the security footage to the jury." Marcus stood immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. We have not been provided adequate time to review this evidence or prepare a response." Linda turned to face him. "Your Honor, the defense was provided with a copy of this footage 3 weeks ago, along with all associated documentation. They have had ample time to review and prepare." Marcus's face flushed. He had received the footage, but Dylan had insisted it would not matter, that it would not show anything incriminating. Marcus had trusted his client, and now he realized his mistake. Judge Brennan looked at Marcus over his reading glasses. "Mr. Webb, do you have any legal grounds for objecting to the presentation of this evidence?" Marcus hesitated, then shook his head. "No, Your Honor." Then the objection is overruled. The state may proceed. Linda Vasquez walked to the prosecution table and picked up a remote control. A large screen had been set up facing the jury, and as the lights in the courtroom dimmed, the screen flickered to life. The footage began with a timestamp in the corner reading September 14th, 8:17 in the evening. The camera showed a hallway with a partial view into the kitchen. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then Robert appeared, walking from the living room toward the kitchen. He was wearing jeans and a gray t-shirt, and he carried a mug of coffee in his hand. A moment later, Dylan appeared behind him. His body language was tense, aggressive. He said something to Robert, inaudible on the recording, and Robert turned around, looking surprised. The conversation continued for nearly a minute, with both figures visible in the frame. Robert appeared to be trying to de-escalate, his hands raised in a placating gesture. Dylan was animated, pointing, gesturing aggressively. Then, suddenly, Dylan turned and walked into the kitchen, disappearing from view. Robert followed him. What happened next would haunt everyone in that courtroom for the rest of their lives. The camera angle did not show the entire kitchen, but it showed enough. Dylan could be seen moving to a drawer, opening it, and removing something. The knife. He turned back toward Robert, and though the actual attack occurred mostly off camera, the violence of it was undeniable. Robert stumbled backward into view, his hands raised defensively, blood already visible on his shirt. Dylan pursued him, striking repeatedly. Robert fell to the floor, partially visible in the frame, and Dylan stood over him, continuing the attack with mechanical precision. 17 stabs. Each one deliberate, each one calculated. When it was over, Dylan stood there for a long moment, staring down at Robert's body. Then he carefully wiped the knife on a kitchen towel, placed it on the counter, and walked out of frame. The timestamp showed that 32 minutes elapsed before Dylan called 911. The courtroom was silent as the footage ended and the lights came back on. Several jurors were crying. Others looked physically ill. Margaret Costa had buried her face in her sister's shoulder, sobbing uncontrollably. And Dylan, the arrogant, narcissistic Dylan who had smirked and joked his way through the trial, sat frozen at the defense table. His face had drained of all color. His hands trembled. His carefully constructed mask of confidence had shattered completely. Linda Vasquez let the silence stretch out, let the weight of what the jury had just witnessed settle over the room. Then she spoke, her voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just seen the truth. Not Dylan's version, not his excuses or his lies. The truth. Dylan Costa did not act in self-defense. He did not lose control in a moment of rage. He deliberately armed himself with a knife. He deliberately attacked his stepfather. And he deliberately inflicted 17 stab wounds over the course of several minutes. This was not an accident. This was murder. First degree, premeditated, intentional murder." She turned to look at Dylan, who was still staring at the now blank screen, his world collapsing around him. The defendant can perform all he wants. He can smirk and joke and pretend none of this matters. But that footage does not lie. That footage shows exactly who Dylan Costa is and what he did. And no amount of acting can change that. Marcus Webb sat slumped in his chair, knowing his case was lost. There was no coming back from this. No argument he could make, no witness he could call, that would undo what the jury had just seen. His client had lied to him, manipulated him, and now they would both face the consequences. Judge Brennan called for a recess, and as the courtroom began to empty, Dylan finally moved. He looked at Marcus with wide, terrified eyes. I didn't think, I mean, I didn't know they could see that much, he stammered. The camera, I thought it was just the hallway. I didn't think. Marcus cut him off. Stop talking, Dylan. Just stop. Dylan's performance was over. The confident, untouchable persona he had maintained throughout the trial had crumbled in an instant, replaced by the stark reality of what he had done and what was about to happen to him. Over the next 2 days, the prosecution rested their case, and Marcus Webb made a half-hearted attempt to present a defense. He called character witnesses who testified that Dylan had experienced trauma and instability in his life, that he had never received proper mental health treatment, that he was still just a child. But after the video, after seeing Dylan's deliberate, calculated actions, the jury was unmoved. Dylan himself never took the stand. Marcus had advised against it from the beginning, knowing Dylan's arrogance would destroy any remaining shred of sympathy the jury might have for him. Now, after the video, it was not even a consideration. The closing arguments were brief. Linda Vasquez summarized the evidence methodically, reminding the jury of every witness, every piece of forensic evidence, and most importantly, the video that proved beyond any doubt that Dylan Costa had committed first-degree murder. Marcus tried to argue that Dylan was still a child, that he deserved a chance at rehabilitation, that a life sentence was too harsh. But his heart was not in it. He knew, just as everyone in that courtroom knew, that Dylan Costa would be convicted. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed once again. Dylan sat at the defense table, no longer smirking or posturing. He looked small and scared, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes fixed on the jury box. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman who worked as a nurse, stood and read the verdict. In the matter of the state of Kansas versus Dylan Costa, on the charge of first-degree murder, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty. Margaret Costa collapsed in tears. Her family embraced her, relief and grief mingling together. Dylan's mother, Patricia, who had attended every day of the trial, let out a wail of anguish. And Dylan, for the first time since his arrest, began to cry. But it was not over yet. Judge Brennan set a sentencing hearing for 2 weeks later, and on that cold February morning, the courtroom gathered one final time. Margaret Costa delivered a victim impact statement, her voice stronger now, filled with righteous anger and grief. She spoke about the man Robert had been, the life they had planned together, the future that Dylan had stolen from them. She spoke about the nightmares that haunted her, the empty space in her bed, the silence in her home. And she spoke about justice, about the need to hold Dylan accountable for what he had done. When she finished, she looked directly at Dylan and said, "I hope you spend every day of your life thinking about what you took from me. I hope you never know peace." Then it was time for sentencing. Dylan stood before Judge Brennan, his lawyer at his side, his hands shaking. The judge looked at him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he began to speak. "Dylan Costa, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers of first-degree murder in the death of your stepfather, Robert Costa. Before I impose sentence, I want to address you directly, because I believe you need to understand the gravity of what you have done and the consequences you will now face." Judge Brennan leaned forward, his voice steady and filled with controlled anger. "Throughout this trial, you have conducted yourself with an arrogance and contempt that I have rarely seen in my 23 years on this bench. You smirked during victim impact testimony. You showed no remorse for your actions. You treated this courtroom as if it were a stage for your performance. as if your charm and confidence could somehow erase the brutal reality of what you did. You calculated that you could manipulate the system, that you could present yourself as a misunderstood teenager, and the jury would show you mercy. You were wrong. The judge paused, letting his words sink in. Dylan's head was bowed, tears streaming down his face. But Judge Brennan was not finished. The video evidence presented in this case showed the truth about who you are, Dylan. It showed a young man who deliberately armed himself with a knife. It showed a young man who pursued his stepfather into the kitchen. It showed a young man who stabbed Robert Costa 17 times over the course of several minutes, while Robert begged for his life and tried desperately to defend himself. That video showed premeditation. It showed intent. It showed cruelty. And it showed that you are not the victim you tried to portray yourself as. Judge Brennan's voice grew harder, more forceful. You want to know what I saw in that video, Dylan? I saw a killer, not a troubled teenager acting out in a moment of passion, not a victim of circumstance defending himself. I saw a calculated, deliberate, cold-blooded killer who ended a human life with no more thought or care than one might give to swatting a fly. You stood over Robert Costa's body after you stabbed him and watched him die. You wiped the knife clean. You waited 32 minutes before calling for help. 32 minutes during which Robert might have been saved if you had acted immediately. But you did not call for help because you did not want him to be saved. You wanted him dead. The courtroom was completely silent. Every eye was on the judge, every ear attuned to his words. Dylan was openly sobbing now, his shoulders shaking, but Judge Brennan showed no sympathy. Let me address your supposed motives. Your defense argued that you had a difficult life, that you experienced trauma and abandonment, that you never received proper mental health treatment. And while those things may be true, they do not excuse what you did. Millions of children grow up in difficult circumstances. Millions of teenagers struggle with anger and resentment toward parental figures. But they do not commit murder. They do not take a knife and stab someone 17 times. You made a choice, Dylan. You chose violence. You chose murder. And now you must face the consequences of that choice. Judge Brennan picked up a document from his desk and held it up. I have read Robert Costa's medical examiner report multiple times. I have studied the descriptions of his wounds, the trajectory of the blade, the evidence of his desperate attempt to survive. I have thought about what his final moments must have been like. The terror and pain and confusion he must have felt as someone he had tried to help. Someone he had opened his home to, brutally attacked him in his own kitchen. I have thought about Margaret Costa, left alone to grieve, to pick up the pieces of a life shattered by senseless violence. And I have thought about you, Dylan, and what kind of person could do such a thing. The judge set the document down and looked directly at Dylan. The prosecution presented evidence that you stood to benefit financially from Robert's death, that you resented his authority and his attempts to parent you, that you had expressed hatred for him and wished him dead. But I believe the truth is even simpler and more disturbing than that. I believe you killed Robert Costa because you wanted to, because in that moment you felt powerful, you felt in control, and you enjoyed it. Dylan shook his head violently, trying to speak, but Judge Brennan held up a hand. I am not finished. You will have your opportunity to speak if you wish. But right now, you will listen. Throughout this trial, you acted as if you were untouchable. You performed for the cameras. You smirked at the victim's family. You showed contempt for this court and for the justice system. You believed with the arrogance of youth and the delusion of narcissism, that you were smarter than everyone else, that you could manipulate your way out of responsibility. The video evidence destroyed that delusion, didn't it, Dylan? It showed everyone in this courtroom exactly who you are. And what you are is a murderer. Judge Brennan's voice softened slightly, but the steel beneath remained. You are 15 years old. In some ways, you are still a child. Your brain is not fully developed. You lack the impulse control and judgment of an adult. The law recognizes this, which is why juvenile offenders are sometimes treated differently than adults. But the law also recognizes that some crimes are so heinous, so calculated, so devoid of humanity, that age becomes irrelevant. First-degree murder is such a crime. And the manner in which you committed this murder, the violence and cruelty you displayed, the complete lack of remorse you have shown, all of these factors lead me to conclude that you pose a continuing danger to society. The judge paused, his expression hardening once more. I have presided over many difficult cases in my career. I have sentenced murderers, rapists, child abusers, and every other kind of criminal you can imagine. But I have never encountered a defendant quite like you, Dylan. Most criminals, even the worst ones, show some flicker of humanity, some recognition of their wrongdoing, some capacity for remorse. You have shown none of that. Even now, as you sit there crying, I do not believe you are crying for Robert Costa or for the pain you have caused his family. I believe you are crying for yourself, for the consequences you are about to face, for the loss of your freedom and your future. Your tears are not remorse. They are self-pity, and that distinction matters. Judge Brennan paused and took a sip of water, his eyes never leaving Dylan's face. I want to talk about Robert Costa for a moment, because in all of this, in all the legal proceedings and arguments and evidence, we must not forget the man whose life was stolen. Robert Costa was 42 years old when you killed him. He had built a successful contracting business from nothing. He employed 15 people, providing good jobs and supporting families in this community. He volunteered at the local homeless shelter. He coached youth baseball. He was, by every account I have heard, a genuinely good human being. The judge's voice took on a note of sadness mixed with anger. When your mother told Robert about you, about your troubled history and the struggles you had faced, he did not hesitate to open his home to you. He could have said no. He could have told your mother that taking on a troubled 15-year-old was too much, too risky, too difficult. But he did not say no. He said yes, because that is the kind of man he was. He believed in second chances. He believed in redemption. He believed that with structure and love and guidance, you could turn your life around. And you repaid his kindness by murdering him. Judge Brennan's hands gripped the edge of his desk, his knuckles white. Do you know what the last words Robert Costa said to your mother were, Dylan? Margaret testified that the morning of his death, as she was leaving for work, Robert told her he loved her. Those were his last words to the woman he loved. He spoke them casually, as people do when they have said those words 1,000 times before, and expect to say them 1,000 times more. He had no idea that in less than 12 hours he would be dead, that you would take that future away from him, that those 3 words, spoken in passing on an ordinary morning, would be the last words his wife would ever hear him say. The judge's voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotion beneath his judicial composure. I have thought a great deal about what Robert must have felt in his final moments. The medical examiner testified that he survived for several minutes after the initial attack, that he was conscious and aware, as he bled out on his kitchen floor. Can you imagine that, Dylan? Can you imagine lying there, feeling your life draining away, knowing that the person who did this to you is someone you tried to help? Someone you opened your home to? Can you imagine the betrayal Robert must have felt? The confusion, the profound sadness of realizing that his kindness and compassion had been repaid with violence? Judge Brennan shook his head slowly. I do not think you can imagine it, Dylan. I do not think you have the capacity for that kind of empathy. And that is what makes you so dangerous. That is what makes this sentence so necessary. A person who can commit this kind of violence without remorse, who can stand over a dying man and feel nothing, who can lie and manipulate and perform for weeks afterward, is not someone who can be rehabilitated, is not someone who can be trusted to return to society, is not someone who deserves a second chance. The judge looked down at his notes, then back at Dylan. Your defense attorney argued that you deserve leniency because of your age, because of your difficult childhood, because you have your whole life ahead of you. But what about Robert Costa's life? He had his whole life ahead of him too. He had plans and dreams and people who loved him. You ended all of that. You took those years away from him. You took those memories and experiences and moments of joy that he will never have. Why should you be shown mercy when you showed none to him? Judge Brennan's voice rose, filling the courtroom with the force of his conviction. Let me be absolutely clear about something, Dylan. This is not about revenge. This is not about making you suffer for the sake of suffering. This is about justice. This is about holding you accountable for your actions. This is about ensuring that you never have the opportunity to hurt anyone else the way you hurt Robert Costa. And yes, this is about sending a message to anyone who might think they can get away with murder, who might think that youth or charm or a sympathetic story will protect them from consequences. That message is simple. You cannot. You will not. The law applies to everyone, regardless of age, and those who choose to violate it in the most heinous ways possible will be punished accordingly. The judge took another sip of water, his hand steady despite the emotion in his voice. The state of Kansas has requested that you be sentenced as an adult and that you receive the maximum penalty allowed under the law. Your defense has argued for leniency, for a sentence that would allow for the possibility of rehabilitation and eventual release. I have considered both arguments carefully. I have reviewed the evidence. I have considered your age and your circumstances, and I have reached a decision. The courtroom held its breath. Dylan looked up at the judge, his face streaked with tears, his eyes desperate. Dylan Costa, for the crime of first-degree murder in the death of Robert Costa, I hereby sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole. This sentence is to be served in an adult facility upon your 18th birthday. Until that time, you will remain in juvenile detention. But make no mistake, you will never be released. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars, thinking about what you did, about the man whose life you ended, about the future you threw away for a moment of violence and rage. Margaret Costa let out a sob of relief. Dylan's mother wailed in anguish, and Dylan himself collapsed in his chair, his body racked with sobs, the reality of his situation finally, truly sinking in. But Judge Brennan was not quite finished. I want you to understand something, Dylan. You believed you were special. You believed you were smarter and more capable than everyone around you. You believed you could get away with murder. But you were wrong. The justice system worked exactly as it should. The evidence was gathered. The truth was revealed. And now you will be held accountable. That is justice. That is the rule of law. And that is something you will have the rest of your life to contemplate. Judge Brennan struck his gavel, the sound echoing through the silent courtroom. This court is adjourned. As the bailiffs moved forward to take Dylan into custody, he tried to stand, but his legs buckled beneath him. They had to support him as they placed him in handcuffs and led him toward the door. As he passed Margaret Costa, he tried to speak, tried to say something, perhaps an apology. But she turned away, refusing to give him even that small moment of acknowledgement. Dylan was led through the courtroom doors and down the hallway toward the transport vehicle that would take him back to juvenile detention. His mother followed, sobbing, calling out to him, but he did not respond. He walked in silence, his head down, his world shattered. Back in the courtroom, Margaret Costa sat with her family, finally allowing herself to feel a measure of peace. The trial was over. Justice had been served. Robert's killer would never walk free again. It did not bring Robert back. It did not heal her pain. But it was something. It was accountability. It was the system working as it should. Linda Vasquez gathered her files and spoke quietly with Detective Jensen, thanking her for her work on the case. Marcus Webb left quickly, avoiding eye contact with anyone, knowing he would be haunted by this case for years to come. And Judge Brennan returned to his chambers, pouring himself a glass of water and sitting heavily in his chair. He thought about Dylan Costa, about the arrogance and narcissism that had led a 15-year-old boy to believe he could get away with murder. He thought about Robert Costa, a good man who had tried to help and paid for it with his life. He thought about all the cases he had presided over, all the defendants he had sentenced, and he knew that this one would stay with him. The case sent shockwaves through the community of Riverton, Kansas. It became national news, a cautionary tale about juvenile violence, about narcissism, about the importance of holding perpetrators accountable regardless of age. People debated the sentence, some arguing it was too harsh for a 15-year-old, others insisting it was exactly what Dylan deserved. But for those who had been in the courtroom, who had seen the video evidence, who had watched Dylan's performance crumble when confronted with the truth, there was no debate. Dylan Costa was a murderer, and justice had been served. In the days and weeks that followed, Margaret Costa began the slow process of rebuilding her life. She established a foundation in Robert's name, dedicated to helping families dealing with troubled teenagers, to providing resources and support before tragedy could strike. She spoke at community events, sharing Robert's story, warning others about the signs of escalating violence. She would never fully heal, would never stop missing her husband, but she found purpose in her pain. Dylan Costa, meanwhile, sat in a juvenile detention cell, counting down the days until his 18th birthday, when he would be transferred to adult prison. The arrogance that had sustained him through the trial was gone, replaced by the crushing reality of what he had done and what he had lost. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, exactly as Judge Brennan had promised. The final image of Dylan Costa was one of a broken soul, led away in handcuffs, his head bowed, his future reduced to concrete walls and steel bars. The performance was over. The mask had fallen, and the truth, undeniable and devastating, had won out in the end. Justice, as imperfect and painful as it sometimes was, had been served. And in the end, that was all that mattered.